basically, orangutans are on the verge of extinction as populations in the wild, not as individuals.
Orangutanes, estudio y conservación. Entrevista a Biruté Galdikas. ¿Cuál es el aspecto más fascinante de los orangutanes?
Oh, there's so many. I can't really give you one. I think the most fascinating thing about them is, despite the fact that they are solitary, they are still, or can be, quite social. Another fascinating thing is how they express friendship and relationship. It's so different from the way that we humans express it. And then the third thing that I find fascinating, and I just learned this a few years ago, is that orangutans are not our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom. That honor, if you will, belongs to chimpanzees. But orangutans are more closely related to our ancestors than we are. So they are not quite ancestors, but almost ancestors. Although they were probably quite different in the expression of their sociality than modern orangutans are.
¿Cuál es la situación de los orangutanes hoy en día y cómo ha cambiado?
Well, they were always on the verge of extinction. It was a little exaggerated when I first went there. People said they're going to go extinct in 3 years in the wild, and it's taken a lot longer than that. But basically, orangutans are on the verge of extinction as populations in the wild, not as individuals, because there are over 500 individual orangutans living in zoos in the United States, Canada, and Europe.
¿Qué opinas de los dos?
Well, I think you have to take zoos with a measure of, what am I looking for? What word? With a measure of doubt, or I think that zoos have changed their attitudes, and now they're trying increasingly to become engines of conservation, which is a very good thing for them to be. And they can be the last stronghold of individuals in a species that has gone extinct or is going extinct in the wild. So an example is that there were some mouth-brooding frogs discovered, and shortly after they were discovered, they went extinct. And I remember thinking, if only somebody had collected a few. I mean, that to me was heresy to even think of it. But I think if zoos do the right thing, then they do have a place in the world. But generally, I'm opposed to zoos.
¿Qué nos queda por descubrir sobre los orangutanes?
Well, we have to probably discover the full extent of their cognitive abilities. We still have to have a better idea of how far the males roam, the adult males roam in their lifetimes, and the sub-adult males. We know that females generally stay in the same area, at least in swamplands, like where I work, wetlands. Females also roam in the mountains. So we really don't know how migratory they are in the mountains, and we don't know how far the males go in terms of their lifetime. I suspect that an adult male orangutan dies, or in the past, died a great distance from where he was born. The females generally die close to where they were born. We kind of can say that with some assurance. So that's one thing that we have to address.
¿En qué consiste el trabajo de tu fundación?
Yeah, it's the Orangutan Foundation International, OFI, and we were established in 1986, and much of the funding for the work that we do comes from that foundation, from OFI, and we do a lot of things. First thing is we study wild orangutans, their ecology, their behavior, their life histories. We also have returned and rehabilitated wild-born ex-captives to life in the wild, and we have rehabilitated about 600 orangutans now. We do it very carefully. You know, we don't just get them and then toss them back in the wild. We want them to succeed, and our experience is we succeeded well. We also plant forests, we plant trees, and so far we started in 2018. Well, we started in 2017, and then seriously in 2018, 2019, and we have planted well over 300,000 trees. And we're talking about 8 people. Now we also hire local people. We provide a source of employment because one of the main threats facing orangutans are these massive fires that emerge during seasons of drought. And the droughts are coming faster and faster and faster because of the El Nino phenomenon, which probably is exacerbated by climate change. Mm-hmm. So I haven't finished. We also have a school program in which we have our educators, who are locals, go to schools and give a 1 to 2 hour lecture to the students in the area where we work. And the research. The research is one of the longest studies of any wild mammal population in the history of science. Mm-hmm. The only thing that comes close is maybe Jane Goodall's study of chimpanzees at Gombe.
¿Cuál te gustaría que fuera tu legado?
Well, my legacy, I hope, is that orangutans survive as populations in the wild. When I'm long gone, that there will still be wild orangutan populations on this earth, both in Borneo and Sumatra. We've done a little bit of work in Sumatra, but not much. We're now concentrating on the Tanjung Puting population, which is arguably the largest wild orangutan population in the world. Mm-hmm. And we want that population to survive. If it survives, then Bornean orangutans can survive.
¿Cuál es tu recuerdo más preciado con los orangutanes?
Again, I have many precious memories, but I think if I had to choose one now, maybe tomorrow I choose another one. Maybe yesterday I would have chosen another one. But what came to mind when you asked me that question is the time that my former husband and I were following a wild adult male orangutan who was not that habituated. And what happened was that my former husband, so I'm sitting on a log, and my former husband, Rod Brindamore, Rod, says to me, he says, "Oh, I've run out of film." And he just gets up and leaves me there. And after he left me, I'm writing in my notebook. The orangutan is on the ground. And the orangutan, I'm sitting here. He comes and he stops right in front of me. He is so close that I could have put my hand on him and patted him. Well, I'm just scribbling in my notebook, pretending like everything is normal. And then he long calls. Whoa! He's about this far away from me. And he long calls. And he doesn't look at me. He never looked at me. He just stands there and he long calls. And I'm just scribbling in my book. Remember, this is a wild, relatively unhabituated adult male orangutan. And he calls, and he calls, and he calls. And those calls can last up to 3 minutes. So I don't know whether it was, a minute, 2 minutes, but it was a long call, a long, long call. And, I'm pretending I'm still writing in my book. And then he stops. There's total silence. And by this time my heart is beginning to beat, because an adult male orangutan could rip you apart. He could tear your limbs off, which is sometimes what they do. And, I've never had this experience before. And then he walks away. just walks away, never looked at me, always from the side, like this. And that is one of the first really close encounters that I've ever had with the wild orangutan, and adult males in particular. So to me, I mean, that moment was so awesome, because here was this creature who had the power to do anything he wanted with me. I mean, I would have screamed and struggled, but still, you know, enormous power. I mean, this is a creature that can open coconuts with his teeth, like nothing flat, right? And yet, he long called. He sent me a message, and I think the message was about his power. That's what the long calls are. They let other males know who they are, probably how powerful the chests are from the way the long call sounds. And then he just walked away. And to me, that moment, it was a mystical experience. It was almost like I was in the presence of God. Well, you're alone in the forest. This is a wild creature that you have absolutely no power over. And he just walked away. So that is one of the, I mean, there are others, but that is the first time that I had a very close encounter with a wild orangutan, physically close. I mean, there have been others, but that was the first one. And of course, so I'm sitting there, and I look at my notebook, and it's all scribbles. It's scribbled. You know, I'm just pretending. I don't want to look at him, but I'm looking at him. I can't stop but look at him because he's right there. And then he walks away, and I'm just sitting there. I didn't follow him for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 minutes because I was so much in awe. And then I hear this banging through the, through the understory. And Rod Brindamore shows up, my former husband shows up, and he's got all kinds of camera bags and aluminum boxes that he carries the camera in. It was like, and I thought, well, it was really irrelevant that you went back to get the film. But I suspect that had he still been there, that orangutan would not have come close to me. And I've had other experiences. I've had experiences where 2 males were fighting, and I remember saying to, it became obvious that one of the males, who was more habituated, these are 2 wild males, that one was more habituated than the other one, and so the one that was habituated kept running, trying to get behind me. And I suddenly realized that he was using me as a shield. And I remember saying to my assistants, I had 2 assistants with me, and I said something like, "What should we do?" And they said, "Run," and then they ran. And I was recording the fight on a little tape recorder, and so when I listened to it again, the question, what should we do? And then they say run, and then you hear the sound of scurrying feet. Well, as soon as they began running, I began running as well. I wasn't going to be left alone with this wild, habituated male trying to use me as a shield. I wasn't afraid of him, but it was the other guy. So I've had experiences like that.
¿Qué piensas del cambio climático?
I think climate change is the real threat to humankind and to the natural world as we know it now. Now, you can't really say that it's a threat to the natural world because the natural world will go on even if we humans go extinct. Evolution will carry on, all those processes will still go on. But what we will lose is we will lose all or many of the species that exist now, especially the specialists. The generalists, and we are generalists, we humans are generalists, will do quite well in the immediate future, but, crows, rats, I don't know who else, won't do that well. But the problem is that once climate change is exacerbated, we humans literally will not be able to live on this planet unassisted by air conditioning and other technology. So human proteins begin to boil. I'm not an expert. I'm going to say at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 105 degrees Fahrenheit, especially in climates where it's very hot, very humid. So we're reaching those kinds of figures now in places like Pakistan. There are cities that are recording 107 degrees, you know, a few days a week. And the only thing that saves them is that it's dry, dry, dry.
¿En qué vas a centrar tu charla?
Well, I'm just going to talk about orangutans. That's what people expect me to talk about, because I've been working with them for almost 50 years. And I believe I have insight into them, or some insight certainly. So I'll talk mainly about orangutans and who they are, what they are, and their life histories. And then I'll talk about the threat, the conservation threats to them, and why they're going extinct in the wild, as populations in the wild. So we're not dealing with the passenger pigeon situation, where the last passenger pigeon, whose name was Martha, you know, died lonely in a zoo cage. What we're talking about is populations, wild populations going extinct in the wild. That's the threat. And it's a major threat. I mean, once those wild populations go, you're going to have a very hard time, you know, putting in the remaining captives back into the wild. For one thing, the wild will have changed, because by living in the forest, the orangutans changed the forest.
¿Estáis estudiando la genética de los orangutanes?
Well, you know, I always had a dream, and that dream is that I would do genetics. And I actually got accepted into a program for middle-aged researchers, so they could learn genetic techniques, and it would be like a year course. And it was actually at the University of California, in the University of California system. And at the time I was teaching, and I still am, at a Canadian university, so it was for American professors, American scientists, and I was thrilled at the generosity of the American government, the American scientific establishment, that they actually allowed me, you know, as a Canadian university professor, to actually join the program and be accepted in the program. Oh, I was just so joyful. Because for years I'd been collecting samples of, you know, orangutan hair. Now, I didn't know how to do it because I wasn't trained in genetics, but I was doing it. And then one of the big disappointments of my life is because it was the third year that program was offered, and only 5 scientists, me included, had applied. And so they decided it wasn't worthwhile, you know, to have all these people teaching us, you know, to use the lab and all that. So they canceled it, and that was one of the 10 or 20 big disappointments of my life. The program was canceled. So the purpose of my trying to understand what was going on in genetics was to understand the composition of the wild population and their genetic structure. But you know, I have a graduate student, and she's with me here, and I think it's better if you speak to her.
My name is Ruth Linsky. I am one of the founding board members of Orangutan Foundation International Canada. I'm a graduate student of Dr. Galdikas at Simon Fraser University in Canada.
¿Qué investigáis hoy en día en genética?
So together we are researching the genetics of the wild population of orangutans at Camp Leakey in Tanjung Puting. And we're looking at understanding the wild population better, so looking at the relatedness, the genetic diversity, and as well as the matrilineal lines and the orangutans that Dr. Galdikas has been studying for 40 plus years, and understanding them better.
¿Cómo ayuda el trabajo de Biruté Galdikas en la investigación genética actual?
Well, her research is hugely important in understanding the relatedness of the orangutans that she's been following, but also behaviorally understanding where the females go and what females and their offspring do, as well as the males and the behavior of them. So it's really important to understand both the behavior and the genetics that results from that behavior.
¿Qué resultados habéis conseguido?
We have some results from my master's research, basically just also proving that we can actually do genetics from the feces of orangutans. So we collected fecal samples from them and just looked at a small kind of subgroup of the wild orangutans and looking at who's related to who.
¿Qué tipo de hallazgos os gustaría hacer en este campo a largo plazo?
Well, I think we want to better understand the wild populations as they exist and better understand how we can help them persist into the future.
¿El desplazamiento de sus lugares natales? ¿Cómo puede afectar a la genética de los orangutanes?
Well, tracing individual orangutans would be one way to do it, but also sampling different populations from the meta population that exists today, so the remaining kind of refuge populations and fragments that are there. So if we can sample from each of those, we can see if there are males moving between areas or if there are related individuals in areas that are some distance apart.